his opinion may be pretty correctly imagined by the ingenious reader for himself, he takes occasion to anticipate some of the most offensive matter of the first blast in a style of real brutality. 369b. It is not merely that he tells them the garments of women do declare their weakness and inability to execute the office of man, though that in itself is neither very wise nor very opportune in such a correspondence, one would think. But if the reader will take the trouble to wade through the long, tedious sermon for himself, he will see proof enough that Knox neither loved, nor very deeply respected, the women he was then addressing. In very truth, I believe these Edinburgh sisters simply bored him. He had a certain interest in them as his children in the Lord. They were continually provoking him by their writing, and, if they handed his letters about, writing to them was as good a form of publication as was then open to him in Scotland. There is one letter, however, in this budget, addressed to the wife of Clerk Register MacGill, which is worthy of some further mention. The Clerk Register had not opened his heart, it would appear, to the preaching of the gospel, and Mrs. MacGill has written, seeking the Reformer's prayers in his behalf. Your husband, he answers, is dear to me for that he is a man endued with some good gifts, but more dear for that he is your husband. Charity moveth me to thirst his illumination, both for his comfort and for the trouble which you sustain by his coldness, which justly may be called infidelity. He wishes her, however, not to hope too much. He can promise that his prayers will be earnest, but not that they will be effectual. It is possible that this is to be her cross in life, that her head, appointed by God for her comfort, should be her enemy. And if this be so, well, there is nothing for it. With patience she must abide God's merciful deliverance, taking heed only that she does not obey manifest iniquity for the pleasure of any mortal man. 371a. I conceive this epistle would have given a very modified sort of pleasure to the Clerk Register, had it chanced to fall into his hands. Compare its tenor, the dry resignation not without a hope of merciful deliverance therein recommended, with these words from another letter, written but the year before to two married women of London: call first for grace by Jesus, and thereafter communicate with your faithful husbands, and then shall God, I doubt not, conduct your footsteps, and direct your counsels to his glory. 371b. Here the husbands are put in a very high place. We can recognize here the same hand that has written for our instruction how the man is set above the woman, even as God above the angels. But the point of the distinction is plain. For Clerk Register MacGill was not a faithful husband, displayed, indeed, towards religion a coldness which justly might be called infidelity. We shall see in more notable instances how much Knox's conception of the duty of wives varies according to the zeal and orthodoxy of the husband. As I have said, he may possibly have made the acquaintance of Mrs. MacGill, Mrs. Guthrie, or some other, or all, of these Edinburgh friends while he was still Douglas of Longniddry's private tutor. But our certain knowledge begins in 1549. He was then but newly escaped from his captivity in France, after pulling an oar for 19 months on the benches of the galley Nostra Dame, now up the rivers, holding stealthy intercourse with other Scottish prisoners in the castle of Rouen, now out in the North Sea, raising his sick head to catch a glimpse of the far-off steeples of St. Andrews. And now he was sent down by the English Privy Council as a preacher to Berwick-upon-Tweed, somewhat shaken in health by all his hardships, full of pains and agues, and tormented by gravel, that sorrow of great men. Altogether, what with his romantic story, his weak health, and his great faculty of eloquence, a very natural object for the sympathy of devout women. At this happy juncture he fell into the company of a Mrs. Elizabeth Bose, wife of Richard Bose, of Ask, in Yorkshire, to whom she had borne 12 children. She was a religious hypochondriac, a very weariful woman, full of doubts and scruples, and giving no rest on earth either to herself or to those whom she honored with her confidence. From the first time she heard Knox preach she formed a high opinion of him, and was solicitous ever after of his society. 373a, nor was Knox unresponsive. I have always delighted in your company, he writes, and when labors would permit, you know I have not spared hours to talk and commune with you. Often when they had met in depression he reminds her, God hath sent great comfort unto both. 373b, we can gather from such letters as are yet extant how close and continuous was their intercourse. I think it best you remain till the morrow, he writes once, and so shall we commune at large at afternoon. This day you know to be the day of my study and prayer unto God, yet if your trouble be intolerable, or, if you think my presence may release your pain, do as the Spirit shall move you. Your messenger found me in bed, after a sore trouble and most dolorous night, and so dolour may complain to dolour when we two meet. And this is more plain than ever I spoke, to let you know you have a companion in trouble. 373c, once we have the curtain raised for a moment, and can look at the two together for the length of a phrase. After the writing of this proceeding, writes Knox, your brother and mine, Harry Wycliffe, did advertise me by writing, that your adversary, the devil, took occasion to trouble you because that I did start back from you rehearsing your infirmities. I remember myself so to have done, and that is my common on consuetude when anything pierceth or toucheth my heart. Call to your mind what I did standing at the cupboard at Alnwick. In very deed I thought that no creature had been tempted as I was, and when I heard proceed from your mouth the very same words that he troubles me with, I did wonder and from my heart lament your sore trouble, knowing in myself the dolour thereof. 374a, now intercourse of so very close a description, whether it be religious intercourse or not, is apt to displease and disquiet a husband, and we know incidentally from Knox himself that there was some little scandal about his intimacy with Mrs. Bose. The slander and fear of men, he writes, has impeded me to exercise my pen so oft as I would, yet, very shameth holden me from your company, when I was most surely persuaded that God had appointed me at that time to comfort and feed your hungry and afflicted soul. God in his infinite mercy, he goes on, remove not only from me all fear that tendeth not to godliness, but from others suspicion to judge of me otherwise than it becometh one member to judge of another. 374b, and the scandal, such as it was, would not be allayed by the dissension in which Mrs. Bose seems to have lived with her family upon the matter of religion, and the countenance shown by Knox to her resistance. Talking of these conflicts, and her courage against her own flesh and most inward affections, yet, against some of her most natural friends he writes it, to the praise of God, he has wondered at the bold constancy which he has found in her when his own heart was faint. 375a. Now, perhaps in order to stop scandalous mouths, perhaps out of a desire to bind the much-loved evangelist nearer to her in the only manner possible, Mrs. Bose conceived the scheme of marrying him to her fifth daughter, Marjorie, and the reformer seems to have fallen in with it readily enough. It seems to have been believed in the family that the whole matter had been originally made up between these two, with no very spontaneous inclination on the part of the bride. 375b. Knox's idea of marriage, as I have said, was not the same for all men, but on the whole, it was not lofty. We have a curious letter of his, written at the request of Queen Mary, to the Earl of Argyll, on very delicate household matters, which, as he tells us, was not well accepted of the said Earl. 375c. We may suppose, however, that his own home was regulated in a similar spirit. I can fancy that for such a man, emotional, and with a need, now and again, to exercise parsimony in emotions not strictly needful, something a little mechanical, something hard and fast and clearly understood, would enter into his ideal of a home. There were storms enough without, and equability was to be desired at the fireside even at a sacrifice of deeper pleasures. So, from a wife, of all women, he would not ask much. One letter to her which has come down to us is, I had almost said, conspicuous for coldness. 376. He calls her, as he called other female correspondents, dearly beloved sister. The epistle is doctrinal, and nearly the half of it bears, not upon her own case, but upon that of her mother. However, we know what Heine wrote in his wife's album, and there is, after all, one passage that may be held to intimate some tenderness, although even that admits of an amusingly opposite construction. I think he says, I think this be the first letter I ever wrote to you. This, if we are to take it literally, may pair off with the 2 or 3 children whom Montin mentions having lost at nurse. The one is as eccentric in a lover as the other in a parent. Nevertheless, he displayed more energy in the course of his troubled wooing than might have been expected. The whole Bose family, angry enough already at the influence he had obtained over the mother, set their faces obdurately against the match. And I dare say the opposition quickened his inclination. I find him writing to Mrs. Bose that she need no further trouble herself about the marriage, it should now be his business altogether, it behoved him now to jeopard his life for the comfort of his own flesh, both fear and friendship of all earthly creature laid aside. 377. This is a wonderfully chivalrous utterance for a reformer 48 years old, and it compares well with the leaden coquetries of Calvin, not much over 30, taking this and that into consideration, weighing together dowries and religious qualifications and the instancy of friends, and exhibiting what M. Bungenner calls an honorable and Christian difficulty of choice, in frigid indecisions and insincere proposals. But Knox's next letter is in a humbler tone. He has not found the negotiation so easy as he fancied. He despairs of the marriage altogether, and talks of leaving England, regards not what country consumes his wicked carcass. You shall understand, he says, that this 6th of November, I spoke with Sir Robert Bose, the head of the family, his bride's uncle, in the matter you know, according to your request, whose disdainful, yet despiteful, words hath so pierced my heart that my life is bitter to me. I bear a good countenance with a sore troubled heart, because he that ought to consider matters with a deep judgment is become not only a despiser, but also a taunter of God's messengers. God be merciful unto him. Amongst others his most unpleasing words, while that I was about to have declared my heart in the whole matter, he said, away with your rhetorical reasons, for I will not be persuaded with them. God knows I did use no rhetoric nor colored speech, but would have spoken the truth, and that in most simple manner. I am not a good orator in my own cause, but what he would not be content to hear of me, God shall declare to him one day to his displeasure, unless he repent. 378. Poor Knox, you see, is quite commoved. It has been a very unpleasant interview. And as it is the only sample that we have of how things went with him during his courtship, we may infer that the period was not as agreeable for Knox as it has been for some others. However, when once they were married, I imagine he and Marjorie Bose hit it off together comfortably enough. The little we know of it may be brought together in a very short space. She bore him 2 sons. He seems to have kept her pretty busy, and depended on her to some degree in his work, so that when she fell ill, his papers got at once into disorder. 379a. Certainly she sometimes wrote to his dictation, and, in this capacity, he calls her his left hand. 379b. In June 1559, at the headiest moment of the Reformation in Scotland, he writes regretting the absence of his helpful colleague, Goodman, whose presence, this is the not very grammatical form of his lament, whose presence I more thirst, than she that is my own flesh. 379c. And this, considering the source and the circumstances, may be held as evidence of a very tender sentiment. He tells us himself in his history, on the occasion of a certain meeting at the Kirk of Field, that he was in no small heaviness by reason of the late death of his dear bedfellow, Marjorie Bose. 379d. Calvin, condoling with him, speaks of her as a wife whose like is not to be found everywhere, that is very like Calvin, and again, as the most delightful of wives. We know what Calvin thought desirable in a wife: good humor, chastity, thrift, patience, and solicitude for her husband's health, and so we may suppose that the first Mrs. Knox fell not far short of this ideal. The actual date of the marriage is uncertain, but by September 1566, at the latest, the reformer was settled in Geneva with his wife. There is no fear either that he will be dull, even if the chaste, thrifty, patient Marjorie should not altogether occupy his mind. He need not go out of the house to seek more female sympathy, for behold, Mrs. Bose is duly domesticated with the young couple. Dr. M. Cry imagined that Richard Bose was now dead, and his widow, consequently, free to live where she would, and where could she go more naturally than to the house of a married daughter. This, however, is not the case. Richard Bose did not die till at least 2 years later. It is impossible to believe that he approved of his wife's desertion, after so many years of marriage, after 12 children had been born to them, and accordingly we find in his will, dated 1558, no mention either of her or of Knox's wife. 380. This is plain sailing. It is easy enough to understand the anger of Bose against this interloper, who had come into a quiet family, married the daughter in spite of the father's opposition, alienated the wife from the husband and the husband's religion, supported her in a long course of resistance and rebellion, and, after years of intimacy, already too close and tender for any jealous spirit to behold without resentment, carried her away with him at last into a foreign land. But it is not quite easy to understand how, except out of sheer weariness and disgust, he was ever brought to agree to the arrangement. Nor is it easy to square the reformer's conduct with his public teaching. We have, for instance, a letter by him, Craig, and Spottywood, to the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, anent a wicked and rebellious woman, one and good, spouse to John Barron, a minister of Christ Jesus his Evangel, who, after great rebellion shown unto him, and divers admonitions given, as well by himself as by others in his name, that she should in no wise depart from this realm, nor from his house without his license, hath not the less stubbornly and rebelliously departed, separated herself from his society, left his house, and withdrawn herself from this realm. 381. Perhaps some sort of license was extorted, as I have said, from Richard Bose, weary with years of domestic dissension, but setting that aside, the words employed with so much righteous indignation by Knox, Craig, and Spottywood, to describe the conduct of that wicked and rebellious woman, Mrs. Barron, would describe nearly as exactly the conduct of the religious Mrs. Bose. It is a little bewildering, until we recollect the distinction between faithful and unfaithful husbands, for Barron was a minister of Christ Jesus his Evangel, while Richard Bose, besides being own brother to a despiser and taunter of God's messengers, is shrewdly suspected to have been a bigoted adherent of the Roman Catholic faith, or, as Knox himself would have expressed it, a rotten papist. You would have thought that Knox was now pretty well supplied with female society. But we are not yet at the end of the roll. The last year of his sojourn in England had been spent principally in London, where he was resident as one of the chaplains of Edward VI, and here he boasts, although a stranger, he had, by God's grace, found favor before many. 382a. The godly women of the metropolis made much of him. Once he writes to Mrs. Bose that her last letter had found him closeted with 3, and he and the 3 women were all in tears. 382b. Out of all, however, he had chosen 2, God, he writes to them, brought us in such familiar acquaintance, that your hearts were incensed and kindled with a special care over me, as a mother useth to be over her natural child, and my heart was opened and compelled in your presence to be more plain than ever I was to any. 382c, and out of the two even he had chosen one, Mrs. Anne Locke, wife to Mr. Harry Locke, merchant, nigh to Beaukirk, Cheapside, in London, as the address runs. If one may venture to judge upon such imperfect evidence, this was the woman he loved best. I have a difficulty in quite forming to myself an idea of her character. She may have been one of the 3 tearful visitors before alluded to. She may even have been that one of them who was so profoundly moved by some passages of Mrs. Bose's letter, which the reformer opened, and read aloud to them before they went. "Oh, would to God," cried this impressionable matron, "would to God that I might speak with that person, for I perceive there are more tempted than I." 383. This may have been Mrs. Locke, as I say, but even if it were, we must not conclude from this one fact that she was such another as Mrs. Bose. All the evidence tends the other way. She was a woman of understanding, plainly, who followed political events with interest, and to whom Knox thought it worthwhile to write, in detail, the history of his trials and successes. She was religious, but without that morbid perversity of spirit that made religion so heavy a burden for the poor-hearted Mrs. Bose. More of her I do not find, save testimony to the profound affection that united her to the reformer. So we find him writing to her from Geneva, in such terms as these: "You write that your desire is earnest to see me. Dear sister, if I should express the thirst and languor which I have had for your presence, I should appear to pass measure. Yet, I weep and rejoice in remembrance of you, but that would evanish by the comfort of your presence, which I assure you is so dear to me, that if the charge of this little flock here, gathered together in Christ's name, did not impede me, my coming should prevent my letter." 384. I say that this was written from Geneva, and yet you will observe that it is no consideration for his wife or mother-in-law, only the charge of his little flock, that keeps him from setting out forthwith for London, to comfort himself with the dear presence of Mrs. Locke. Remember that was a certain plausible enough pretext for Mrs. Locke to come to Geneva, the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on earth since the days of the apostles, for we are now under the reign of that horrible monster Jezebel of England, when a lady of good orthodox sentiments was better out of London. It was doubtful, however, whether this was to be. She was detained in England, partly by circumstances unknown, partly by empire of her head Mr. Harry Locke, the Cheapside merchant. It is somewhat humorous to see Knox struggling for resignation, now that he has to do with a faithful husband, for Mr. Harry Locke was faithful. "Had it been otherwise, in my heart," he says, "I could have wished," yea, here he breaks out, "yea, and cannot cease to wish, that God would guide you to this place." 385. And after all, he had not long to wait, for, whether Mr. Harry Locke died in the interval, or was wearied, he too, into giving permission, 5 months after the date of the letter last quoted, Mrs. Anne Locke, Harry her son, and Anne her daughter, and Catherine her maid arrived in that perfect school of Christ, the Presbyterian Paradise, Geneva. So now, and for the next 2 years, the cup of Knox's happiness was surely full. Of an afternoon, when the bells rang out for the sermon, the shops closed, and the good folk gathered to the churches, psalm book in hand, we can imagine him drawing near to the English chapel in quite patriarchal fashion, with Mrs. Knox and Mrs. Bose and Mrs. Locke, James his servant, Patrick his pupil, and a due following of children and maids. He might be alone at work all morning in his study, for he wrote much during these 2 years, but at night, you may be sure there was a circle of admiring women, eager to hear the new paragraph, and not sparing of applause. And what work, among others, was he elaborating at this time, but the notorious first blast? So that he may have rolled out in his big pulpit voice, how women were weak, frail, impatient, feeble, foolish, inconstant, variable, cruel, and lacking the spirit of counsel, and how men were above them, even as God is above the angels, in the ears of his own wife, and the 2 dearest friends he had on earth. But he had lost the sense of incongruity, and continued to despise in theory the sex he honored so much in practice, of whom he chose his most intimate associates, and whose courage he was compelled to wonder at, when his own heart was faint. We may say that such a man was not worthy of his fortune, and so, as he would not learn, he was taken away from that agreeable school, and his fellowship of women was broken up, not to be reunited. Called into Scotland to take at last that strange position in history which is his best claim to commemoration, he was followed thither by his wife and his mother-in-law. The wife soon died. The death of her daughter did not altogether separate Mrs. Bose from Knox, but she seems to have come and gone between his house and England. In 1562, however, we find him characterized as a sole man by reason of the absence of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Bose, and a passport is got for her, her man, a maid, and 3 horses, whereof 2 shall return, as well as liberty to take all her own money with her into Scotland. This looks like a definite arrangement, but whether she died at Edinburgh, or went back to England yet again, I cannot find. With that great family of hers, unless in leaving her husband she had quarrelled with them all, there must have been frequent occasion for her presence, one would think. Knox at least survived her, and we possess his epigraph to their long intimacy, given to the world by him in an appendix to his latest publication. I have said in a former paper that Knox was not shy of personal revelations in his published works, and the trick seems to have grown on him. To this last tract, a controversial onslaught on a Scottish Jesuit, he prefixed a prayer, not very pertinent to the matter in hand, and containing references to his family which were the occasion of some wit in his adversary's answer, and appended what seems equally irrelevant, one of his devout letters to Mrs. Bose, with an explanatory preface. To say truth, I believe he had always felt uneasily that the circumstances of this intimacy were very capable of misconstruction, and now, when he was an old man, taking his good night of all the faithful in both realms, and only desirous that without any notable slander to the Evangel of Jesus Christ, he might end his battle, for as the world was weary of him, so was he of it. In such a spirit it was not, perhaps, unnatural that he should return to this old story, and seek to put it right in the eyes of all men, ere he died. Because that God, he says, because that God now in his mercy hath put an end to the battle of my dear mother, Mistress Elizabeth Bose, before that he put an end to my wretched life, I could not cease but declare to the world what was the cause of our great familiarity and long acquaintance, which was neither flesh nor blood, but a troubled conscience upon her part, which never suffered her to rest but when she was in the company of the faithful, of whom, from the first hearing of the word at my mouth, she judged me to be one. Her company to me was comfortable, yea, honorable and profitable, for she was to me and mine a mother, but yet it was not without some cross, for besides trouble and fasherie of body sustained for her, my mind was seldom quiet, for doing somewhat for the comfort of her troubled conscience. 388. He had written to her years before, from his first exile in Dieppe, that only God's hand could withhold him from once more speaking with her face to face, and now, when God's hand has indeed interposed, when there lies between them, instead of the voyageable straits, that great gulf over which no man can pass, this is the spirit in which he can look back upon their long acquaintance. She was a religious hypochondriac, it appears, whom, not without some cross and fasherie of mind and body, he was good enough to tend. He might have given a true character of their friendship, had he thought less of his own standing in public estimation, and more of the dead woman. But he was in all things, as Burke said of his son in that ever memorable passage, a public creature. He wished that even into this private place of his affections posterity should follow him with a complete approval, and he was willing, in order that this might be so, to exhibit the defects of his lost friend, and tell the world what weariness he had sustained through her unhappy disposition. There is something here that reminds one of Rousseau. I do not think he ever saw Mrs. Locke after he left Geneva, but his correspondence with her continued for 3 years. It may have continued longer, of course, but I think the last letters we possess read like the last that would be written. Perhaps Mrs. Locke was then remarried, for there is much obscurity over her subsequent history. For as long as their intimacy was kept up, at least, the human element remains in the reformer's life. Here is one passage, for example, the most likable utterance of Knox's that I can quote. Mrs. Locke has been upbraiding him as a bad correspondent. My remembrance of you, he answers, is not so dead, but I trust it shall be fresh enough, albeit it be renewed by no outward token for 1 year. Of nature, I am churlish, yet one thing I shame not to affirm, that familiarity once thoroughly contracted was never yet broken on my default. The cause may be that I have rather need of all, than that any have need of me. However that be, it cannot be, as I say, the corporal absence of 1 year or 2 that can quench in my heart that familiar acquaintance in Christ Jesus, which half a year did engender, and almost 2 years did nourish and confirm. And therefore, whether I write or no, be assuredly persuaded that I have you in such memory as becometh the faithful to have of the faithful. 390. This is the truest touch of personal humility that I can remember to have seen in all the 5 volumes of the Reformer's collected works. It is no small honor to Mrs. Locke that his affection for her should have brought home to him this unwanted feeling of dependence upon others. Everything else in the course of the correspondence testifies to a good, sound, downright sort of friendship between the two, less ecstatic than it was at first, perhaps, but serviceable and very equal. He gives her ample details as to the progress of the work of Reformation, sends her the sheets of the Confession of Faith, inquires as he calls it, asks her to assist him with her prayers, to collect money for the good cause in Scotland, and to send him books for himself, books by Calvin especially, one on Isaiah, and a new revised edition of the Institutes. I must be bold on your liberality, he writes, not only in that, but in greater things as I shall need. 391a. On her part she applies to him for spiritual advice, not after the manner of the drooping Mrs. Bose, but in a more positive spirit, advice as to practical points, advice as to the Church of England, for instance, whose ritual he condemns as a mingle-mangle. 391b. Just at the end she ceases to write, sends him a token, without writing. I understand your impediment, he answers, and therefore I cannot complain. Yet if you understood the variety of my temptations, I doubt not but you would have written somewhat. 391c. One letter more, and then silence. And I think the best of the Reformer died out with that correspondence. It is after this, of course, that he wrote that ungenerous description of his intercourse with Mrs. Bose. It is after this, also, that we come to the unlovely episode of his second marriage. He had been left a widower at the age of 55. 3 years after, it occurred apparently to yet another pious parent to sacrifice a child upon the altar of his respect for the Reformer. In January 1563, Randolph writes to Cecil, "Your Honour will take it for a great wonder when I shall write unto you that Mr. Knox shall marry a very near kinswoman of the Duke's, a lord's daughter, a young lass not above 16 years of age." 392. He adds that he fears he will be laughed at for reporting so mad a story. And yet it was true, and on Palm Sunday, 1564, Margaret Stuart, daughter of Andrew Lord Stuart of Argylltray, aged 17, was duly united to John Knox, minister of St. Giles's Kirk, Edinburgh, aged 59, to the great disgust of Queen Mary from family pride, and I would fain hope of many others for more humane considerations. In this, as Randolph says, I wish he had done otherwise. The Consistory of Geneva, that most perfect school of Christ that ever was on earth since the days of the apostles, were wont to forbid marriages on the ground of too great a disproportion in age. I cannot help wondering whether the old Reformer's conscience did not uneasily remind him, now and again, of this good custom of his religious metropolis, as he thought of the 42 years that separated him from his poor bride. Fitly enough, we hear nothing of the second Mrs. Knox until she appears at her husband's deathbed, 8 years after. She bore him 3 daughters in the interval, and I suppose the poor child's martyrdom was made as easy for her as might be. She was extremely attentive to him at the end, we read, and he seems to have spoken to her with some confidence. Moreover, and this is very characteristic, he had copied out for her use a little volume of his own devotional letters to other women. This is the end of the roll, unless we add to it Mrs. Adamson, who had delighted much in his company by reason that she had a troubled conscience, and whose deathbed is commemorated at some length in the pages of his history. 393, and now, looking back, it cannot be said that Knox's intercourse with women was quite of the highest sort. It is characteristic that we find him more alarmed for his own reputation than for the reputation of the women with whom he was familiar. There was a fatal preponderance of self in all his intimacies. Many women came to learn from him, but he never condescended to become a learner in his turn. And so there is not anything idyllic in these intimacies of his, and they were never so renovating to his spirit as they might have been. But I believe they were good enough for the women. I fancy the women knew what they were about when so many of them followed after Knox. It is not simply because a man is always fully persuaded that he knows the right from the wrong and sees his way plainly through the maze of life, great qualities as these are, that people will love and follow him, and write him letters full of their earnest desire for him when he is absent. It is not over a man, whose one characteristic is grim fixity of purpose, that the hearts of women are incensed and kindled with a special care as it were over their natural children. In the strong quiet patience of all his letters to the weariful Mrs. Bose, we may perhaps see one cause of the fascination he possessed for these religious women. Here was one whom you could besiege all the year round with inconsistent scruples and complaints. You might write to him on Thursday that you were so elated it was plain the devil was deceiving you, and again on Friday that you were so depressed it was plain God had cast you off forever, and he would read all this patiently and sympathetically, and give you an answer in the most reassuring polysyllables, and all divided into heads, who knows, like a treatise on divinity. And then, those easy tears of his. There are some women who like to see men crying, and here was this great-voiced, bearded man of God, who might be seen beating the solid pulpit every Sunday, and casting abroad his clamorous denunciations to the terror of all, and who on the Monday would sit in their parlors by the hour, and weep with them over their manifold trials and temptations. Nowadays, he would have to drink a dish of tea with all these penitents. It sounds a little vulgar, as the past will do, if we look into it too closely. We could not let these great folk of old into our drawing rooms. Queen Elizabeth would positively not be eligible for a housemaid. The old manners and the old customs go sinking from grade to grade, until, if some mighty emperor revisited the glimpses of the moon, he would not find any one of his way of thinking, anyone he could strike hands with and talk to freely and without offense, save perhaps the porter at the end of the street, or the fellow with his elbows out who loafs all day before the public house. So that this little note of vulgarity is not a thing to be dwelt upon, it is to be put away from us, as we recall the fashion of these old intimacies, so that we may only remember Knox as one who was very long-suffering with women, kind to them in his own way, loving them in his own way, and that not the worst way, if it was not the best, and once at least, if not twice, moved to his heart of hearts by a woman, and giving expression to the yearning he had for her society in words that none of us need be ashamed to borrow. And let us bear in mind always that the period I have gone over in this essay begins when the reformer was already beyond the middle age, and already broken in bodily health. It has been the story of an old man's friendships. This it is that makes Knox enviable. Unknown until past 40, he had then before him 35 years of splendid and influential life, passed through uncommon hardships to an uncommon degree of power, lived in his own country as a sort of king, and did what he would with the sound of his voice out of the pulpit. And besides all this, such a following of faithful women. One would take the first 40 years gladly, if one could be sure of the last 30. Most of us, even if, by reason of great strength and the dignity of grey hairs, we retain some degree of public respect in the latter days of our existence, will find a falling away of friends, and a solitude making itself round about us day by day, until we are left alone with the hired sick nurse. For the attraction of a man's character is apt to be outlived, like the attraction of his body, and the power to love grows feeble in its turn, as well as the power to inspire love in others. It is only with a few rare natures that friendship is added to friendship, love to love, and the man keeps growing richer in affection, richer, I mean, as a bank may be said to grow richer, both giving and receiving more, after his head is white and his back weary, and he prepares to go down into the dust of death. The End. Printed by R&R Clark, Limited, Edinburgh. Footnotes: 0. Gaudeamus, Carmina Vagarum Selecta. Leipzig. Trubner. 1879, 27, Prefatory Letter to Peveril of the Peak. 71, For the Love Affairs C, in particular, Mr. Scott Douglas's edition under the different dates. 179, Yoshida, when on his way to Nagasaki, met the soldier and talked with him by the roadside. They then parted, but the soldier was so much struck by the words he heard, that on Yoshida's return he sought him out and declared his intention of devoting his life to the good cause. I venture, in the absence of the writer, to insert this correction, having been present when the story was told by Mr. Mazaki. F.J. and I, there being none to settle the difference, must reproduce both versions. RLS 185. I understood that the merchant was endeavoring surreptitiously to obtain for his son instruction to which he was not entitled. F.J. 192. Étude biographique sur François Villon. Paris, H. Menu. 195. Bougiers de Paris, ed. Pantheon, pp. 688, 689. 196, Bourgeois, pp. 627, 636, and 725. 204, Chronique scandaleuse, ed. Pantheon, p. 237. 210, Monstrelet, Pantheon littéraire, p. 26. 220a, Cron. Scand. Ut supra. 220b, Here and There, principally in the order of events. This article differs from M. Longnan's own reading of his material. The ground on which he defers the execution of Montigny and de Caeux beyond the date of their trials seems insufficient. There is a law of parsimony for the construction of historical documents. Simplicity is the first duty of narration, and hanged they were. 224, Cron. Scand, p. 338. 238, Champollion Fijeux Louis et Charles d'Orleans, p. 348. 240a, de Héricault's admirable memoir, prefixed to his edition of Charles's works, volume I p. 11. 240b, Valete de Varival, Charles VII. Its son Epoch, 2. 428, Note 2. 241a, See l'Écueil de la Marche, Le Roi René, I 167. 241b, Valete, Charles VII, 2. 85, 86, Note 2. 241c, Champollion Fijeux, 193198. 242a, Champollion Fijeux, 209. 242b, the student will see that there are facts cited, and expressions borrowed, in this paragraph, from a period extending over almost the whole of Charles's life, instead of being confined entirely to his boyhood. As I do not believe there was any change, so I do not believe there is any anachronism involved. 243, The Debate Between the Heralds of France and England, translated and admirably edited by Mr. Henry Pine. For the attribution of this tract to Charles, the reader is referred to Mr. Pine's conclusive argument. 244, Des Ursins. 248, Michelet, 4. App. 179, p. 337. 249, Champollion Fijeux, pp. 27982. 250, Michelet, 4. pp. 1234. 253, Debate Between the Heralds. 254, Sir H. Nicholas, Agincourt. 257a, Debate Between the Heralds. 257b, Works, ed. de Héricault, I 43. 257c, Ibid. 143, 258a, Works, ed. de Héricault, I 190. 258b, Ibid. 144, 258c, Ibid. 158, 259a, M. Champollion Figeac gives many in his editions of Charles's works, most, as I should think, of very doubtful authenticity, or worse. 259b, Reimer, x 564. Die Heracolt's Memoir, Peaksley. Gairdner's Paston Letters, I-27, 99. 260, Champollion Figeac, 377. 262a, Dom Plancher, 4. 1789. 262b, Works, I-15763. 265a, Valites Charles VII, I-251. 265b, Précis de Génie d'Arc, I-13355. 267a, Monstrelet. 267b, Valites Charles VII, 3. Chap. I but see the chronicle that bears Jacquet's name, a lean and dreary book. 268, Monstrelet. 269, Die Heracolt's Memoir, XL. Xlevalit, Charles VI, 2. 435, 271a, Champollion Figeac, 368. 271b, Works, I-115. 271c, Die Heracolt's Memoir, XLV. 272, Champollion Figeac, 381, 361, 381. 273, Champollion Figeac, 359,361. 276a, L'Écueil de la Marche, Roy René, 2. 155, 177. 276b, Champollion Figeac, Chaps. V and 6. 276c, Ibid. 364, Works, I-172. 276d, Champollion Figeac, 364, Cheta de l'argent auxiliary pétis en fans qui estoyant au long de Bourbon, pour les faire non enlo itala quer l'argent au fond. 277a, Champollion Figeac, 387. 277b, Nouvelle biographie d'Edith, Art. Marie de Cleves. Valite, Charles VII, 3. 85, Note 1. 277c, Champollion Figeac, 383, 384386. 278, Works, 2. 57, 258. 329, Gabriel's Église de Genève, I-88. 330a, La démocratie chez les prédicateurs de la Ligue. 330b, Historia effectuum esse imicentium controversi de Gynecocratia. It is in his collected prefaces, Leipzig, 1683. 333a, Œuvre de d'Orbigne, I-449. 333b, Dames Illusters, pp. 358-360. 334, Works of John Knox, 4. 349, 341, M. Cry's Life of Knox, 2. 41, 342, described by Calvin in a letter to Cecil, Knox's Works, Volume 4. 344, it was anonymously published, but no one seems to have been in doubt about its authorship. He might as well have set his name to it, for all the good he got by holding it back. 345a, Knox's Works, 4. 358, 345b, Strips Aylmer, p. 16. 346a, it may interest the reader to know that these, so says Thomasius, are the ipsissima verba Schlüsselberg. 346b, I am indebted for a sight of this book to the kindness of Mr. David Lang, the editor of Knox's Works. 348, Social Statics, p. 64, etc. 349, Hallam's Const. Hist. of England, I 225, Note M. 352a, Knox to Mrs. Locke, the 6th of April, 1559. Works, 6. 14, 352b, Knox to Sir William Cecil, the 10th of April, 1559. Works, 2. 16, or 6. 15, 354, Knox to Queen Elizabeth, July 20th, 1559. Works, 6. 47, or 2. 26, 355, Knox to Queen Elizabeth, the 6th of August, 1561. Works, 6. 126, 357, Knox's Works, 2. 278-280. 359, Calderwood's History of the Kirk of Scotland, edition of the Wardrow Society, 3. 51-54. 360, Bale's Historical Dictionary, Art. Knox, Remark G, 368, Works, 4. 244, 369a, Works, 4. 246, 369b, Ib. 4 225. 371a, Works, 4. 245, 371b, Ib. 4 221. 373a, Works, 6. 514, 373b, Ib. 338. 373c, Ib. 352, 353. 374a, Works, 3. 350, 374b, Ib. 390, 391. 375a, Works, 3. 142, 375b, Ib. 378. 375c, Ib. 379. 376, works, 3. 394, 377, works, 3. 376, 378, works, 3. 378, 379a, works, 6. 104, 379b, ib. v5. 379c, ib. 627. 379d, ib. 138. 380, Mr. Lang's preface to the 6th volume of Knox's works, Peelxi. 381, works. 6 534. 382a, works, 4. 220, 382b, ib. 380. 382c, ib. 220. 383, works, 3. 380, 384, works, 4. 238, 385, works, 4. 240, 388, works, 6. 513, 514. 390, works, 6. 2391a, works, 6. pp. 21 101, 108, 130. 391b, ib. 683. 391c, ib. 129. 392, works, 6. 532, 393, works, I246. End of the Project Gutenberg ebook Familiar Studies of Men and Books Updated editions will replace the previous one, the old editions will be renamed. Creating the works from print editions not protected by U.S. copyright law means that no one owns a United States copyright in these works. So the Foundation, and you, can copy and distribute it in the United States without permission and without paying copyright royalties. Special rules, set forth in the general terms of use part of this license, apply to copying and distributing Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works to protect the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol concept and trademark. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark, and may not be used if you charge for an ebook, except by following the terms of the trademark license, including paying royalties for use of the Project Gutenberg trademark. If you do not charge anything for copies of this ebook, complying with the trademark license is very easy. You may use this ebook for nearly any purpose such as creation of derivative works, reports, performances and research. Project Gutenberg ebooks may be modified and printed and given away. You may do practically anything in the United States with ebooks not protected by U.S. copyright law. Redistribution is subject to the trademark license, especially commercial redistribution. Start, Full license. The full Project Gutenberg license. Please read this before you distribute or use this work to protect the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol mission of promoting the free distribution of electronic works. By using or distributing this work, or any other work associated in any way with the phrase Project Gutenberg, you agree to comply with all the terms of the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license available with this file or online at www.gutenberg.org/license. Section 1. General Terms of Use and Redistributing Project Gutenberg Trademark Symbol Electronic Works 1.0. By reading or using any part of this Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work, you indicate that you have read, understand, agree to and accept all the terms of this license and intellectual property, trademark/copyright, agreement. If you do not agree to abide by all the terms of this agreement, you must cease using and return or destroy all copies of Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works in your possession. If you paid a fee for obtaining a copy of or access to a Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work and you do not agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement, you may obtain a refund from the person or entity to whom you paid the fee as set forth in paragraph 1.e.8. 1.b. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark. It may only be used on or associated in any way with an electronic work by people who agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement. There are a few things that you can do with most Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works even without complying with the full terms of this agreement. See paragraph 1.c below. There are a lot of things you can do with Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works if you follow the terms of this agreement and help preserve free future access to Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works. See paragraph 1.e below. 1.c. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the Foundation or PGLAF, owns a compilation copyright in the collection of Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works. Nearly all the individual works in the collection are in the public domain in the United States. If an individual work is unprotected by copyright law in the United States and you are located in the United States, we do not claim a right to prevent you from copying, distributing, performing, displaying or creating derivative works based on the work as long as all references to Project Gutenberg are removed. Of course, we hope that you will support the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol mission of promoting free access to electronic works by freely sharing Project Gutenberg trademark symbol works in compliance with the terms of this agreement for keeping the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol name associated with the work. You can easily comply with the terms of this agreement by keeping this work in the same format with its attached full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license when you share it without charge with others. 1.d. The copyright laws of the place where you are located also govern what you can do with this work. Copyright laws in most countries are in a constant state of change. If you are outside the United States, Check the laws of your country in addition to the terms of this agreement before downloading, copying, displaying, performing, distributing or creating derivative works based on this work or any other Project Gutenberg trademark symbol work. The Foundation makes no representations concerning the copyright status of any work in any country other than the United States. 1.e Unless you have removed all references to Project Gutenberg, 1.e.1. The following sentence, with active links to, or other immediate access to, the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license must appear prominently whenever any copy of a Project Gutenberg trademark symbol work, any work on which the phrase Project Gutenberg appears, or with which the phrase Project Gutenberg is associated, is accessed, displayed, performed, viewed, copied or distributed. This ebook is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this ebook or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this ebook. 1.e.2. If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work is derived from texts not protected by U.S. copyright law, does not contain a notice indicating that it is posted with permission of the copyright holder, the work can be copied and distributed to anyone in the United States without paying any fees or charges. If you are redistributing or providing access to a work with the phrase Project Gutenberg associated with or appearing on the work, you must comply either with the requirements of paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 or obtain permission for the use of the work and the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol trademark as set forth in paragraphs 1.e.8 or 1.e.9. 1.e.3. If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work is posted with the permission of the copyright holder, your use and distribution must comply with both paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 and any additional terms imposed by the copyright holder. Additional terms will be linked to the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license for all works posted with the permission of the copyright holder found at the beginning of this work. 1.e.4. Do not unlink or detach or remove the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license terms from this work, or any files containing a part of this work or any other work associated with Project Gutenberg trademark symbol. 1.e.5. Do not copy, display, perform, distribute or redistribute this electronic work, or any part of this electronic work, without prominently displaying the sentence set forth in paragraph 1.e.1 with active links or immediate access to the full terms of the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license. 1.e.6. You may convert to and distribute this work in any binary, compressed, marked up, non-proprietary or proprietary form, including any word processing or hypertext form. However, If you provide access to or distribute copies of a Project Gutenberg trademark symbol work in a format other than plain vanilla ASCII or other format used in the official version posted on the official Project Gutenberg trademark symbol website, www.gutenberg.org, you must, at no additional cost, fee or expense to the user, provide a copy, a means of exporting a copy, or a means of obtaining a copy upon request, of the work in its original plain vanilla ASCII or other form. Any alternate format must include the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license as specified in paragraph 1.e.1. 1.e.7. Do not charge a fee for access to, viewing, displaying, performing, copying or distributing any Project Gutenberg trademark symbol works unless you comply with paragraph 1.e.8 or 1.e.9. 1.e.8. You may charge a reasonable fee for copies of or providing access to or distributing Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works provided that you pay a royalty fee of 20% of the gross profits you derive from the use of Project Gutenberg trademark symbol works calculated using the method you already use to calculate your applicable taxes. The fee is owed to the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol trademark, but he has agreed to donate royalties under this paragraph to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. Royalty payments must be paid within 60 days following each date on which you prepare, or are legally required to prepare, your periodic tax returns. Royalty payments should be clearly marked as such and sent to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation at the address specified in Section 4, Information about donations to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. You provide a full refund of any money paid by a user who notifies you in writing, or by email, within 30 days of receipt that he does not agree to the terms of the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license. You must require such a user to return or destroy all copies of the works possessed in a physical medium and discontinue all use of and all access to other copies of Project Gutenberg trademark symbol works. You provide, in accordance with paragraph 1.f.3, a full refund of any money paid for a work or a replacement copy, if a defect in the electronic work is discovered and reported to you within 90 days of receipt of the work. You comply with all other terms of this agreement for free distribution of Project Gutenberg trademark symbol works. 1.e.9. If you wish to charge a fee or distribute a Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work or group of works on different terms than are set forth in this agreement, you must obtain permission in writing from the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the manager of the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol trademark. Contact the Foundation as set forth in Section 3 below. 1.f1.f.1. Project Gutenberg volunteers and employees expend considerable effort to identify, do copyright research on, transcribe and proofread works not protected by U.S. copyright law in creating the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol collection. Despite these efforts, Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works, and the medium on which they may be stored, may contain defects such as, but not limited to, incomplete, inaccurate or corrupt data, transcription errors, a copyright or other intellectual property infringement, a defective or damaged disk or other medium, a computer virus, or computer codes that damage or cannot be read by your equipment. 1.f.2 Limited warranty. Disclaimer of damages, except for the right of replacement or refund described in paragraph 1.f.3. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol trademark, and any other party distributing a Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work under this agreement, disclaim all liability to you for damages, costs and expenses, including legal fees. You agree that you have no remedies for negligence, strict liability, breach of warranty or breach of contract except those provided in paragraph 1.f.3. You agree that the Foundation, the trademark owner, and any distributor under this agreement will not be liable to you for actual, direct, indirect, consequential, punitive or incidental damages even if you give notice of the possibility of such damage. 1.f.3 Limited right of replacement or refund. If you discover a defect in this electronic work within 90 days of receiving it, you can receive a refund of the money, if any, you paid for it by sending a written explanation to the person you received the work from. If you received the work on a physical medium, you must return the medium with your written explanation. The person or entity that provided you with the defective work may elect to provide a replacement copy in lieu of a refund. If you received the work electronically, the person or entity providing it to you may choose to give you a second opportunity to receive the work electronically in lieu of a refund. If the second copy is also defective, you may demand a refund in writing without further opportunities to fix the problem. 1.f.4 Except for the limited right of replacement or refund set forth in paragraph 1.f.3, this were provided to you